All right, people, this is officially a Talkin TV first. This is going to be something that I have never done on this channel before, that none of us obviously have ever done on this channel before. Khris is on vacation, and today for our Space Jam New Legacy podcast, I watched the movie on Friday. I had a guy lined up to do this, and then after watching the movie, I said, you know what? You can sit this one out. I got this, because, oh man, that should be an indicator of the movie as far as for you guys should know. And yeah, because I put it this way, I don't want to have anyone else have to sit through this movie just in general, like for this podcast or anything else. So without further ado, this is the official Talkin TV solo pod for Space Jam, A New Legacy. Stay tuned. Never been done on the podcast before, as I stated on the intro. You guys should all know who I am. You guys know what podcast this is as far as that goes. So the reason kind of behind this and kind of what led to this podcast as far as that goes is, so a couple months ago, back during the pandemic, when everyone was kind of stuck in lockdown, not really sure of what to do with themselves, I was listening. Obviously, I've stated on this podcast before that I'm a huge fan of the Rewatchables podcast. Ever since I discovered them during the pandemic, they were kind of like a source of lifeblood for me as far as that goes, as far as, you know, kind of, I'd say the rekindling of my interest in wanting to continue towards YouTube back when I'll be honest, I didn't know where this podcast was going to go. I didn't know kind of what the implications were going to be. I didn't know what was going to happen on the other side of COVID as far as all that goes. And the Rewatchables and just discovering the Ringer Network was a big source of kind of inspiration for me. And Bill Simmons did the solo podcast for Castaway. Obviously, he kind of played in thematically. Obviously, you know, one man stuck on an island with nothing to talk to but a volleyball for the entirety of it. And I don't necessarily know if the context for that applies as much to this, but like I stated in the intro, I texted Khris my thoughts on this. So the reason why Khris isn't here, Khris is on vacation right now, much earned vacation, if I'm being completely honest. The man has been a workhorse throughout this entire thing. So obviously, shout out to him. He is getting some much needed R&R, you know, and also enjoying the ability that we have to now finally, you know, leave our own homes and actually travel to other parts of the country now. It's just, it's so good to actually have that ability back. So, but we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about Space Jam, which dropped on HBO Max this past Friday, July 16th. The latest in their lineup of movies that they were going to do the simultaneous drop of on both streaming and theaters as well. And my whole thing, right, is when Khris told me that he wasn't going to be around, obviously, for vacation, I told him, I'm like, I can't just get, back when I was going to do this with a co-host, I was like, I can't just get any co-host for this, right? I've got to get somebody who has that Space Jam energy, right? Because Space Jam, for something that was originally intended to have one very specific, very commercial purpose, it's almost kind of evolved and gained kind of this secondary life in the internet age, in the Disney age, as far as that goes. And it's really fascinating, I feel like, to examine as far as that goes, because the kind of the cultish following that's developed around the original Space Jam is obviously a big part of the reason why we now have this sequel, obviously, because famously, it's known this sequel has been in development hell for years. At one point, LeBron was interested, then at another point, he walked away, and then now he's finally back in. And so it was kind of a push and pull back and forth. They've been trying to make this sequel since the first one was such a smash hit in the back all the way back in '96. So the plans for the sequel to Space Jam, what's it called? The idea was always that it was going to be involve like a new basketball competition, and they did originally want to bring Michael Jordan back. As far as that goes, they were going to have them fight against a new species of aliens that was going to be voiced by Mel Brooks. Joe Pytka, the director of the original, was going to come back. Brandt and Tony Cervone were signed back on as the for the animation supervisors. The only problem is Michael Jordan, of course, as is usually the case with most sequels, did not want to come back for the sequel. So as a result, they were like, oh, shit, what do we do now? So it was floated around for through a lot of different places. Apparently, it was originally actually supposed to star Jackie Chan at one point. There, you know, numerous amounts of scripts. But the point being is, this has always been one of those things. You've heard stories about this before, about scripts that have laggard and waved and sat in development hell in Hollywood for years on end. But back in 2014, and I actually think I remember this because I actually think that I remember hearing news of a Space Jam sequel, but with LeBron this time as the signature basketball star rather than Michael Jordan. I actually do slightly remember hearing stories about that back in high school. So that would actually line up with this as far as our timeline goes, because it was officially announced. Warner Brothers announced that they were going to be doing development on the sequel back in February of 2014. Apparently, Charlie Ebersol was set to produce. Willie Ebersol was set to write the script. And what's it called? So LeBron actually signed the deal around the time that he was doing Trainwreck. Apparently, Justin Lin signed on as director at one point. Kobe Bryant also apparently expressed an interest in directing the film. What's it called? But in September 2018, it wasn't until Ryan Coogler officially became attached to the project that this thing was really officially set to go. What's it called? Principal photography began on June 25th, 2019. What's it called? Malcolm D. Lee, the director of the Best Man movies, Undercover Brother, and the fifth Scary Movie, as I wrote in my Letterboxd review, was brought on. Bradford Young was apparently set to be the cinematographer on this project. That's insane to know. That ended very quickly as far as that goes. But so now that's the production. That's the history behind like how this movie came to be, right? But it all kind of stems from the fact that the original Space Jam was such a smash hit as far as that goes. And the story behind the original Space Jam is so long and extensive that I feel like it requires like a completely secondary podcast. And the fact that I'm already just here by myself and just talking for an hour, I feel like that's already enough for you guys to deal with as far as that goes. So basically kind of what I wanted to talk about first, as far as kind of what this movie means, before we even actually get into the implication of it, right, is what this movie means kind of for movies going forward. And what I mean by that is the original Space Jam, let's not kid ourselves. We all know that it was originally conceived as nothing more than a Nike commercial that just happened to star Michael Jordan and the Looney Tunes because it was based off of a Nike commercial that Ivan Reitman directed starring Michael Jordan and Bugs Bunny. And then the producers were like, hey, why don't we just make this into a movie? And that's what eventually led to it. So kind of in a weird way, it almost is like, I feel like a good figurehead as far as kind of how this sort of sense of mass commercialization and use of IP has sort of come into being, right? We always know that that's been a part of media sphere, but like obviously it's become much more so in recent years, literally to the point where you had TV shows like 30 Rock making, in my opinion, very, very clever jokes as far as how to kind of incorporate, you know, different obvious marketing ploys and product placements in. Obviously, we know that Michael Bay has become famous for it's almost like he's in a competition with himself to see how much product placement he can throw into movies, right? But the original Space Jam was interesting because this is the first time I think ever where something that was designed as a commercial product ended up growing and evolving into like this massive rabid cult movement around this. Like I know I've had conversations with this about my brother for years, trying to figure out like what the appeal of this movie is, but how that kind of factors in and connects to the new one. So the new movie, and I said this from the beginning, I'm like, okay, just based on what I'm seeing from the trailer, like when that first trailer dropped, as far as what they're trying to do here, as far as kind of, I'm like, okay, so like there's elements of Matrix here, there's elements of like, you know, obviously being drawn into a computer simulation. It's got, you know, those 80s elements of like having to go into this alternate world in order to retrieve something that's been lost there. And it immediately became clear to me. That I'm like, oh, okay. So Warner Brothers is using this, and not only, obviously, Warner Brothers is using this as a commercial for HBO Max, is what I'm trying to get at, right? We all know they botched the release. You know, the announcement of the simultaneous release of the movies on both HBO Max and in theaters as well was a big, what obviously was a big, let's call it, was a big selling point in order to get people to download the app and not just, you know, and then not just unsubscribe from it. Like they effectively ended, They ended 1 week subscription terms in order to prevent that, because that's just what people do. They download the apps, they make their 1 week subscription test run, get their stuff, and then bail out. It's exactly what people were doing with Disney Plus when that first dropped with The Mandalorian, because there was, until Disney started producing more consistent content this year, there really wasn't that much that it had going for it as far as new stuff goes, because it was just the fact of, okay, now we have one place with all the Disney content where we can see it. So that became immediately clear to me, and I'm like, all right, but look, the original Space Jam is still pretty beloved and pretty enjoyable outside of the commercial aspects. What else can we do? As far as, you know, I'm willing to give this a chance as far as that goes. You know, am I the most excited for it? No. Did we really need a Space Jam sequel? No. But again, that sentiment and statement can be applied to pretty much 90% of the movies that we get now. So I was like, okay, so where else can we go from here? And now that we've actually seen the movie, I'm like, oh, So there wasn't anything else here. There was absolutely no intent here. Like I checked. Like it's funny. There were like everyone was making that comment obviously during the opening credits when they accidentally credit the same writer twice. It's I don't remember what the guy's name was. It's Terence Nance I think, but they end up crediting him twice. It's like Terence Nance and Terence Nance. It was I'm surprised it hasn't already been made into a meme that's been like circulating the internet. But I'm like there are so many credited writers on this script, and it becomes immediately clear to me. I'm like, oh, they just had different writers coming in to do like different scenes depending on the day as far as that, because that's what this movie feels like. It feels like every other scene that happens was written by a different writer, because I'm not going to lie, just as far as plot goes, like again, the first movie, it's safe to say people don't watch the first movie for the plot. As far as that goes, we know this. We're attuned to this. We understand that the most appealing senses will be like, okay, we know exactly what we're getting. We're going in. We're gonna watch one half of a movie about Michael Jordan that serves as like a little bit of an origin story. We're going to watch another half of a movie that's a zany Looney Tunes cartoon, and then by the end, they're going to come together and play this basketball game. It's simple. It's short. It's easy to appeal. You know, is it the deepest? Does it have the most compelling story? No, but it's enjoyable enough, and it's got like a fairly simplistic, not simplistic, that's the wrong word to use. It's got a fairly understandable trajectory and tone and direction. Not this movie. Oh man. I guess you know what? I'm not even gonna bother with the lack of spoilers, because like I don't know. I'm gonna be honest. I don't actually know how much I can say without spoiling this movie, so I'm just gonna get into it. So the essential plot of this movie, it's kind of insane. I knew that this was going to be kind of accomplishing the same thing as the first one did, as far as just being an extended commercial for whatever product it is that Warner Brothers wants to push out at the time, as far as their deal goes. But I didn't realize just how much of the first one they were going to recycle here, because it's almost beat for beat the same movie, just as far as kind of the inspiration goes behind the basketball player and how that factors into his current struggle and how he ends up, recruiting the Looney Tunes as far as that goes. But and guys, again, if you can keep up with me, kudos, because there is a lot of shit to break down. So starts off in 96. LeBron is a kid. He basically, his friend gives him a Game Boy Color Advance, which has just come out at the time. And then his basketball coach just yells at him and is like, oh, if you want to be good at basketball, you can't be playing video games. Very finger waggy, very naggy, very in your face, very like, oh, wow. Not at all obvious as far as that goes. Subtlety. I think that's kind of been lost in movies recently. And so, of course, that leads into the usual montage of like him, becoming an NBA superstar. I'm not going to lie. I'm not a basketball guy at all. In fact, I'm not a sports guy at all. I've gone out of my way to call, just anything involving a ball, sports ball, multiple times over. I'll say that probably of all of the sport genre movies, I think that the two that I definitely gravitate towards as far as always providing the most compelling story to me are boxing and basketball movies. I have seen a couple basketball movies recently that kind of were doing, kind of a similar thing. Uncle Drew, when that came out a couple of years ago, I enjoyed that movie for what it was. But so we have the typical montage. But so I'm not gonna say that I'm not as up on LeBron as I should be, but like I'm not in with the zeitgeist. I'm not aware of LeBron's contributions really to anything. So I kind of just have to go based off of everyone's word about him being as good as basketball as obviously people know of. He's in the NBA Hall of Fame, is kind of the overall world champion, but I know that he's obviously become a divisive figure in recent years. So we have the typical montage of everything that he's accomplished, and then it cuts to the modern day with him and his two sons. The one older son, who I think just recently just made the news, I think. I mean, they changed the names, obviously, and they're played by, actors. But I do think that it's kind of funny as far as, like, oh, right when this movie came out, his oldest son makes the news. And you see his oldest son shooting basketballs, and I'm like, oh, okay, so that's not the kid that we're going to focus on here. And then it goes to the younger son, who's off to the side playing a video game. And you see his dad kind of giving him the same pep talk that his coach gave him at the beginning. And I'm like, oh, that's what this is going to be. This is going to be that same old tired cliche of the dad not understanding and trying to bond with his son thing, and them having to go on a magical journey together in order to rebond with each other that we've seen 1.5 million times over again. I'm like, okay, so that's simplistic enough. That I understand. Then we get into the virtual space, and we meet our villain of the movie, a character by the name of Al G. Rhythm, funny little clever play on words there, portrayed by Don Cheadle, who I'll just say up front right now is the best part about this movie, easily. Like, Don Cheadle is one of those actors where ever since I was really introduced to him, I feel like a lot of other people, just with, a majority of, the mainstream actors that had careers before Marvel, but because of just, the time that we were born in, we really are not aware of anything else outside of Marvel. So Obviously, I was introduced to him in Iron Man 2, and I've, expanded out and seen some other movies that he's been in. Obviously, I'm a tremendous fan of the Ocean's trilogy, even though I still have no idea what the fuck kind of accent he's doing in that movie. And Don Cheadle, you could tell, is probably the only actor that they could actually afford for this movie as far as that goes, because I think the only other big-name actor that they have for this movie is the actress who plays LeBron's wife in the movie, who is Sonequa Martin-Green, who portrayed Sasha in The Walking Dead. And there are, like, no other, like, recognizable stars that are, like, not just in cameos. Like, I know they have Steven Yeun and Sarah Silverman as, like, these studio executives that are trying to pitch LeBron James on a movie. But, like, for all intents and purposes, the rest of the movie is literal cartoon characters and just CG, other Warner Brothers IP. So they didn't really need to expand out as far as the amount of actors that they needed for this movie. So they got Don Cheadle to play this villain who... And bear with me if you can here, who, because he's kind of the AI that Warner Brothers has been using to kind of organize their vast content library, but he feels that he needs recognition and sentience. Like that, I don't actually know. This is the part that confused me, because this is the part where it feels like the screenwriters actually had some iota of creativity here that they wanted to actually do, inside of this giant HBO Max LeBron commercial, which is that, okay, I want recognition for my contributions, but I'm not getting it properly. So now what am I going to do? And, basically it's he's pissed because Warner Brothers is trying to pitch LeBron on this idea of CGing him virtually into their movies going forward. And basically when he says no, because I feel like, probably the only smart move that he does in the entire movie, where he's like, oh, I don't want to do this. This is weird. And this don't feel like movies as far as that goes. And some line that that algorithm takes the wrong way. And so he comes up with this evil plan to to gain worldwide notoriety by challenging LeBron to a basketball game and beating him, and therefore using his followers to gain the recognition that he so wants. That's our villain plan of the movie. That's just one half of it, right? So that, of course, leads to the inevitable part that you saw in the trailers, him and his son getting into the argument, going down to the basement, them getting sucked into that giant glowing ball, because let's face it, that's the only way that studios know how to, like, provide a capable interface between reality and artificial reality, which is just have a giant glowing ball, No more beaming. The days of beaming someone into an artificial reality space from Tron are over with. So that happens. Then he brings LeBron into the virtual space. He's like, okay, I've got your son. You want your son back? You gotta, what's it called? You have to beat me in a basketball game, as far as that goes. And then he, of course, is like, hey, send him to Rejectville as far as that goes. And that's, of course, where we bring in the Looney Tunes. Because this, I think, personally, brings up the idea that is probably, for me personally, the only bit of something that could have actually been relevant and actually interesting had they chosen to pursue it, which is the idea of, Warner Brothers has assembled this massive library of content since the days of the Looney Tunes cartoons. And so it's kind of, in a weird way, made the Looney Tunes cartoons a little bit less, I'm not going to say less relevant, but, like, obviously, not as many kids are watching Looney Tunes cartoons as they are, like, the latest big name brand IPs. And again, far be it from me to try and give, like, gigantic studios who are just trying to shove their commercial products in our face more credit that they deserve, but I at least thought, I'm like, okay, that's actually kind of an interesting idea that might worth spelling out, because when LeBron lands in Toontown and he sees it's deserted, like, there's no one there, and he sees Bugs Bunny trying to compensate by himself, but, like, Bugs Bunny is the only Toon left in Toontown, and it's kind of sad, honestly, and it's kind of I'm like, wait, are they actually trying to give Bugs Bunny, the one of the most popular and iconic cartoon characters of all time, somebody who has literally become like a brand mascot in and of himself, an actual character arc here? And I'm not gonna lie, that actually was kind of interesting as far as that goes. I was actually kind of interested in pursuing the idea of, okay, what do the Looney Tunes have to do in order to quote-unquote make themselves relevant and cool and hip in today's kind of modern-day AI, algorithm, social media, instant gratification-driven sphere, right? Especially since the Looney Tunes are characters that were based off of, this idea of just this constant zaniness, in a weird way, constantly trying to capture people's attention by just, like, these very poppy, flashy animation palettes and these, crazy over-the-top stunts, and the fact that in recent years they've gotten into, like, cartoon logistics. Like, it all, in a weird way, kind of does lend itself towards the story. And of course, had they pursued that, I feel like that would have been something interesting. But no, it's nothing more than just a gimmick in order to get us on what we then spend the next 20 minutes doing, which is just them going to different Warner Brothers produced movies in the quote-unquote Warner serververse, which of course contains all of these different worlds. It's very Ready Player One-esque. I'll get into that in a bit. And to all of these different worlds where all of the Looney Tunes have kind of gone off to. Something about something about Algae Rhythm giving them a chance to like be more relevant by being in other movies. So that of course leads to a 20-minute sequence where it's just LeBron and Bugs Bunny going to all of these different movies to recruit the Looney Tunes. I think it's like they've got Daffy Duck and Porky Pig are in the animated DC world. Elmer Fudd's and Austin Powers, Granny and Speedy Gonzalez are in the Matrix because of course they just, for whatever reason, they decided to just have Granny doing all of these slow-mo kung fu moves because why? I don't know. That's just one of those decisions. So I'm like, oh, okay, cool. That latest Hollywood executive, doing a line of coke and being like, oh yeah, that's totally something we should do. Trying to think. Well, Yosemite Sam is the piano player in Casablanca. I'm like, this is where I'm like, okay, so this is the point where if this movie's intentions weren't clear enough, this is where they absolutely become clear. Because, oh man, like I've seen some shameless shit in my time, but this might take the cake as far as that goes, and that's all before the third act, right? Keep this in mind too, right? We obviously know the structure of these movies by this point, right? First half is spent establishing, like, the conflict and the villain along with the basketball player. Then by the time you actually get them together, that lasts pretty short as far as that goes. Because, again, I said this before, the amount of actual time between when Michael Jordan arrived in Toontown versus when the actual basketball game started, it's not that much time. It's really not. The only major sequence that really happens is him sending Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck to break into his house to steal his shorts and shoes. Not at all problematic in today's day and age. Not at all. that aged incredibly well, if you can't sense the dripping sarcasm in my voice. But this movie's a full 2 hours long, right? The original Space Jam is only clocks in at an hour 40. Nice, tight, breezy. You could watch it like over and over again, and it works. This movie's 2 hours long, like full 2 hours, like hour 55, give or take. But like this movie's a full 2 hours long, and while I will say that it doesn't have a decent amount of pacing problems, this is definitely the point where I'm like, okay, the commercialism aspects are starting to overtake whatever quote unquote plot was happening here, And of course it leads into the typical, Algae Rhythm is manipulating LeBron's son because he's got these crazy insane computer skills. He literally built an entire goddamn video game on his own, and this is again where I'm beginning to question it. It's like, wait, LeBron, like LeBron doesn't care. LeBron doesn't want his son to make video games, even though the video game design industry is one of the biggest sources of revenue right now for young up-and-coming coders. And besides the fact that coding is one of the best jobs as far as that goes, it's just one of those things where I'm like, I know it's a movie, but the logistics of it, like, I just can't get into it. I just can't, because that's the point where I'm like, I'm too in tune with reality at this point, and as far as what works, in order for, like, any sort of, like, quote-unquote old-school Hollywood, like, stories to really work on me. So that's automatically where that falls apart. And so we know, obviously, that Don Cheadle is going to be using his son in order to design, like, the ultimate basketball team, which, again, it's kind of disappointing, I will say, because, again, as far as the elements that they took from the first movie almost beat for beat, kind of the interest of the original was seeing that we actually, for the first half, did actually get to spend a little bit of time with the aliens who would eventually become the Monstars, and kind of, seeing them go around and steal all the other basketball players' talents. That was actually kind of interesting as far as that goes. I actually thought that was fun and that was charming. We actually got to know those characters a little bit. Actually, I feel it gave us at least some bit of backstory to what would eventually just become like these hulking monstrous things that were just there to, like, provide, basic bare bone scary looking antagonists as far as that goes. But here it's just generic CG mix of we're just going to take basketball players that are, that obviously LeBron knows pretty well, and then just do CG hybrids of them with animals. It's like a falcon. I don't, unlike the last one where I know all the names of the basketball players whose talent was stolen, in order to give the monsters the talent in the original, I couldn't name a single one. I think there was like a brief Kyrie Irving cameo, but again, not attuned to basketball, wouldn't know any of the stars even if I tried. Again, sports fans, come at me in the comments, pointed out, by all means, again, it's movie nerd, not sports nerd. But so the basketball players that they get in order to provide the antagonists, the goon squad, I think is what they call them. It's like a falcon hybrid, a fire hybrid, a water hybrid, a snake hybrid, a spider hybrid, and then this weird clock hybrid that can like literally stop time. And so the incentive for the final basketball game, once they finally assemble the Looney Tunes and they get going for the basketball game, is okay, so the idea is they're not actually playing basketball. The goal is essentially to play it like it's a video game, where instead of just playing it regularly and scoring hoops regularly, they essentially have to show off with all of these different crazy graphics and do all of these crazy advanced plays that include all these different video game logistics. And the third act quite literally becomes a video game, because I said I wrote this on my review. This shit is like Ready Player One on all of the drugs. Just all of the drugs that you could think of. It is Ready Player One on that, because the visual nonstop palette of just all of the different Warner Brothers characters coming in, and then of the actual logistics of the basketball game. My thing that I said is this is probably the first time where I actually understood what it was like for a Gen Xer to be watching all of the Marvel movies, which again, I love the Marvel movies, but like I'll be the first person to admit that the CG in those movies does get a little bit much. It does get to be a little bit much of visual onslaught. Never anything that I can't handle, but I now understand what it is that the problem that people have with the visuals and kind of how incomprehensible and how hard to follow they are, because oh my God, this basketball game, I even said this, I'm like, I actually had to pause the movie at one point and just to take a break, just to give my eyes and my brain a break, because I'm like, holy shit, even for my ADD addled brain that constantly needs something going on in order to occupy it, this is too much. This is absolutely too much. And this is the point where, again, the rest of the movie I feel like is pretty predictable as far as the plot goes. So this is where I'll get into kind of the points where I'm starting to, where I'm kind of starting to understand what it is that, that people are starting to complain about as far as modern day movies go. Because as far as bringing back the Scorsese arguments of the idea that movies now are essentially just nothing but visual flair, right? I get that, right? I think it's a little bit hypocritical, because movies have always needed action kind of in order to make themselves appealing as far as that goes. But like, I understood where he was coming from, where the primary bulk of theater going fare now is just for spectacle. It's just in order to see Tom Cruise climb up the Burj Khalifa, or it's just to see the latest Marvel action set piece, or it's just to see the latest James Bond action set piece. Like, I even said this, like, I was looking over some of my favorite movies from 2021 so far, and I'm like, holy shit. Almost all of my top 10 are action movies, Quiet Place 2, Wrath of Man, Nobody, Army of the Dead. Like, what's it called? Like, very few of them have kind of some of those, like, extra elements, those extra, the occasional drama, Obviously, we've got a decent amount of animated movies right now. That seems to be, like, the one kind of brief respite. But I was looking, I'm like, holy shit. There have been no major mainstream movies that have gotten any attention this year that are not action movies in some way, The exception I feel like being Judas and the Black Messiah, but that was back during the whole kind of Oscars confusion as far as, is this a 2020 or a 2021 movie, between obviously with Nomadland and Minari's release as far as that goes. So to think of Judas and the Black Messiah as a 2021 film is already confusing enough. And the reason why I bring that up is because this is, I believe, because this is the first year, because every year for the last couple of years, during kind of like the Disney corporate takeover of Hollywood, has at the very least, there's always been like that one movie, that one kind of like little lesser known drama that was able to sneak through the cracks and get kind of like that notoriety. But this year, for my money, there isn't one. Not one. Like, I know Chris and I talked about mainstream on this channel, and we obviously did the Zola review a couple weeks ago, and and A24 has always seemed to be the exception. But like, put this in perspective, we're even at a point now where A24 is even looking for a buyout as far as that goes. And I bring all of this up because I feel like this factors into my point as far as what this movie means when it comes to where movies are going in the future. And I've talked to a couple people who did like this movie and and were entertained by this movie. And I didn't do that usual douchebag movie bro thing that I do most of the time. I'll admit, I have fallen victim to this a couple times where I'm like, oh my God, I have no idea what you meant. Why? What did you see in this movie? I, for the life of me, have no idea what anyone could see in this movie. And to be honest, just people in general have got to stop doing that, because it's demeaning. And I feel like what that kind of means as far as, for what kids today are going to grow up with and what they're going to get out of their movies, right? I feel like it's kind of part of the reason of what I've been trying to accomplish and what Khris and I have both been trying to accomplish with this podcast is trying to figure out what it is that people have loved about movies in the past, and really how we're at this point where that is really changing. And we're trying to do is we're just trying to figure out why. We're trying to figure out what it is. What is it that has made people so much more willing to gravitate towards, quite frankly, mediocre products that these studios put out that make billions of dollars just based off of this recognizable IP, right? We've had the IP discussion. We've had the nostalgia discussion. We've had the CG discussion. We've had the history discussion. We've had all of those discussions before. And so that's old news. But so the thing that I wanted to bring up as far as in order to kind of gear the second half of this podcast, as far as kind of why this movie doesn't work ultimately as a movie, quite so even less than the first one, but also kind of what it means for movies going forward is I saw a comment the other day regarding like, all y'all adults stop trying to critically review Space Jam. It's for kids, which that just comments like that infuriate me to no end because I'm like, okay, so you're just demeaning kids movies now because you're saying that no kids movie should really be taken seriously or critically received or just, held to, the standards of cinema that that make movies so good and make us love them so much. Not only that, but you're also basically saying, oh, yeah, why do we even review movies? Why do we even care about good movies as far as that goes? But that's the thing, right? That's the kind of the point and the struggle that we constantly bring up, that we constantly find ourselves in this push, pull, back and forth on, right? What is a good movie? What is it that we want from our entertainment, right? Do we want something to just, lay back and quote unquote turn our brain off to, or do we want something more thought-provoking and intellectual, right? And that's kind of, I feel like, what the Hollywood movies have been trying to reflect this past year. But the reason why I bring up kind of the more commercialized elements of this is because it's ultimately cynical. It's telling kids, all it's doing is telling kids, hey, here's all of these things that you may or may not recognize based off of what your parents like, because let's be honest, how many kids that are born now, like there are those brands that are recognizable amongst many others, but like this isn't Disney, right? This isn't Star Wars that we're talking about, right? Which has become pretty universal. Like there's one shot where it's like DC superheroes that are recognized, but like I guess what I'm trying to get at is what ultimately is the point of telling kids, right? Because this is a kids movie, right? This is a movie that is made ultimately for children primarily. What ultimately kind of is the point of telling kids, oh, here's that thing from this, and here's that thing from this, right? Oh, here's a Flintstone, here's a Pennywise, here's a King Kong, here's an Iron Giant, right? There's certain intellectual properties and IP that kids will recognize, right? If we're just talking about this from a Brandt consumer's point, but like the majority of people who would recognize this are stuff that are for people my age who grew up with the original Space Jam, and that's kind of where we find themselves in this weird spot, right? As far as kind of taking the whole nostalgia element to this whole new level, because now, right, the majority of people who Hollywood are making movies for are people in my age bracket, right? But not necessarily little kid, like people in my age bracket, which is strange because for the longest time, my age bracket is the one that was seemingly ignored by Hollywood. But now we're the primary focus. We're the primary demographic. We're the ones that are going online and making, making all of these different websites and making all of these different chats and making all these different tweets and kind of essentially acting as a second form of advertising for these movies. So what confuses me is when they try to appeal to us, but not necessarily in a way in which we can share it, right, with kind of the future, the next generation, right? Because I know a lot of people who are my age are just starting to get married and have kids. I'm a little bit on the younger age end of that bracket, but like a lot of like younger millennials and Gen Zers are starting to get into that point where they're, starting to get into relationships and having kids and everything like that. And the part that confuses me is I'm like, I really do want to know like what this has for it for kids, because I guess, and this is where kind of ultimately the crux of how this compares to the first one comes in, because at the end of the day, right, yes, the first movie is an extended commercial, without a doubt. But the thing that ultimately makes it, for me, is the fact that in a weird way, you can kind of distance yourself, because for my money, I never even noticed that it was like a Nike branded commercial, right? I can kind of distance myself, and because the cartoonish sensibilities of that movie are really, really well thought out and really, really well done, and the animation is really, really well done, it kind of almost does play out as this extended Looney Tunes cartoon that just happens to feature real people, and the sensibilities are childish enough and immature enough that like a kid could gravitate towards it and, be kind of enraptured by it as far as that goes. Obviously, yes, the whole Lola Bunny of it all. Yeah, I'm still a little bit confused why a cartoon artist felt the need to apply, female, obviously, feminine body parts onto an animal, specifically a talking cartoon animal. My mind is baffled by the motivation behind that, but and obviously that leads into the whole one of many controversies that led to this movie, because of course of all fucking movies, Space Jam has to have controversies around it in the modern day, or around the kind of the reconstruction of the Lola Bunny character as far as all that goes, and. But that's kind of where the endearment and the charm, I feel, of the original Space Jam comes from. Not necessarily why it developed the cultish feel. I feel like that's a different thing as far as just the internet in general and how fanboys on the internet are concerned. But ultimately, that's kind of where the first Space Jam works. It works kind of as this extended Looney Tunes cartoon. This movie, I have no idea how this is going to work. This movie, to me, it doesn't work as a sports movie. It doesn't work as a Ready Player One-esque nostalgia bait fest, because the only uses of the actual, Warner Brothers IP are just for like brief one-off bits. And like, how many people now are like gonna recognize them? Like, how much, specifically kids, right? I'm talking kids specifically, which again now are pretty much all born after the year like 2008 or 9, right? That's what I'm talking, right? Because the majority of the people born before that are like now entering high school, right? That's the crazy thing. People born in 2007 are now entering high school, right? What kid now is going to recognize The Matrix? What kid now is going to recognize Casablanca? What kid, like the only one of those that they would recognize is DC, right? So that's where I'm confused as far as that goes, because I'm like, okay, just as far as like what I like to call a member bearers contest, as far as, okay, recognizing all of these different IPs, it doesn't work as far as that goes. It doesn't work even as a Looney Tunes cartoon, because the actual Looney Tunes elements are eradicated once they get into the CG-filled third act and they turn the traditionally animated CG Looney Tunes into these CG character versions of themselves, which is just, oh man, that was visual nightmare on a whole different level. So it doesn't work there. It certainly doesn't work as a father-son bonding movie, mostly because of just the terrible cliches and shticks of that movie. So just as far as like if we're breaking down like how this works as a movie, I'm lost. I'm legitimately lost for words, because just looking at any different possible element and way in which this could work as a movie, it doesn't. So as far as just kind of like, let's say applying a critical lens, right? Something that is slowly becoming more and more lost with the age of the internet. We can't even do that one, right? And as far as how this compares to the first one, I can't even really compare it as far as like a cartoonish element, because for my money at least, and I'll admit, I'm not the primary demographic. That's also kind of one of the last points that I'll break down and discuss. I'm not the primary demographic for this movie, so I'm not somebody who's really definitely going to get something, I feel like, out of this movie, right? Because again, I was talking before about how all these movies seem to be made for people my age, but in this instance, right, it's definitely a movie that I feel like that is made for a much younger demographic. But for my money, right, I'm like, Jesus, so if this is the next level of CG, this is the next level, this is what kids younger than me are going to grow up with, and I don't even know what that's going to do to their brain development as far as that goes. I already know that people my age, our brain development has been completely thrown off because, we were just enmeshed in the internet from a young age, and now, with kids now, I don't even know how that's going to go. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the other thing that I wanted to bring up as far as, where this movie could have worked is the fact that the few interesting ideas that they do have, even though it was completely misguided, whatever, the idea of the algae rhythm character and everything that Don Cheadle's bringing to that part, again, like he actually does manage to bring in, like, even if the jokes don't always work, like just his sense of smoothness and charisma, like he really is legitimately trying to act. And again, he's had 10 years of experience of acting in front of Marvel green screen, so like he knows what he's doing as far as that goes. In fact, he's probably the only actor that knows what he's doing as far as that goes. But as far as kind of the, the kiddie element, as far as that goes, and as far as the elements of this that could have worked as far as the Looney Tunes go, they don't follow that through, because they have this one cheap fake out at the end where it's like, oh my god, they have this thing where Bugs Bunny does this move, this glitch move that will delete him from the system that was set up earlier on in the movie, and the idea being like, oh my god, could Bugs Bunny die? And then at the end it's like, nope, he's just there in the real world. And I'm like, okay, just what? We're like, now cartoons can just cross into the real world now. It just, we talked a lot about stakes and movies not having any lasting stakes now, and the reason why that's slowly going away, because just, stakes in movies are not exactly ideal for, having these IPs and these recycled stories that you just want to push forward and continue to franchise forever, because that's ultimately what these movie studios want, is to have these franchises that literally go on forever. That way they can keep churning out money, right? Again, it's the way in which kind of Marvel solved the franchise problem that Hollywood had been trying to crack for the last 10 years at that point throughout the 2000s, right? Harry Potter, I feel like, was the first big example of that, and then Marvel just took over and is still going. Like we're on year 12 of Marvel, and they're arguably stronger now than they ever have been before. And so it ultimately begs the question, I feel, of what is it that movies are trying to accomplish anymore, right? If the actual artists and the creators are secondary and disposable now, right? What even is it that they're trying to accomplish? Like, what is it that movies are trying to say now? And I know that's kind of a moot point, right? I know that's a point that we've brought up before, right? The idea of people not wanting messages, quote unquote, politics in their movie. I get all that, right? But that's not what I'm talking about here. The whole idea, right, that I learned and that I kind of came to understand about movies as I got older is this idea that, all of the best movies, all of your favorite movies are gonna have some life lesson that you'll be able to apply and take away from and be able to apply to your life as far as that goes. That's personally why movies appeal to me. That's why I love them. I know that's why a lot of other people love them, is because they can always get that extra element, that extra bit of kind of empathy, right? It allows them to empathize with and understand people and just really anything that normally they wouldn't give the second time of day. What I found is that people tend to not be the most open-minded. They tend to not be the most forgiving. They tend to be very territorial. They tend to be very, very in their own worlds and not as willing to want to expand. And movies kind of give them that ability that they slowly lose over time as they get older, right? So what kills me about kind of the modern day onslaught is all of these new big budget blockbuster movies that are coming now. And I think the reason why people like me who love kind of the old school movies are becoming so disillusioned with movies is because there's nothing there ultimately, right? You can have like this big, giant, poppy, flashy artifice with all of these different references that people may or may not get. But at the end of the day, the thing that I found is that as time goes on, the movies that were always focused on the present are the movies that never lasted, and are the movies that people now are like, oh yeah, that movie? Oh yeah, that was a thing for a minute, right? And the problem is I think if I can, put on my film bro hat and kind of add something to the Scorsese comments from a couple of years ago, I feel like that is becoming more of the norm, is the problem. The idea of making something because it's based off of an IP, not because a writer and creator has an idea, right? Obviously, that's been the running joke of Hollywood for the last couple of years, but there were always those movies that were kind of still trying to, have the classic struggle of, have the classic ideas of cinema in there without, that were able to sneak through the cracks. But now, in the year of our Lord 2021, it feels like that's going away, because it just feels like that's not the case. Because again, what indie movies have there been this year that people know about? Mainstream had like 5 minutes of Time in the Sun, and half the people don't even know about that. Something like Mitchell's vs. the Machines, which even though that comes from a big name studio, it's sold off to Netflix. Like, there's a lot of creative intent behind that, and it's actually really funny and really well thought out. And the animation is really good, and that's dropped on Netflix to a place where no one can find it. And so, at the risk of sounding like a grouchy, curmudgeon-y old man, my whole thing is that I personally feel like this is the point of no return as far as movies go. I really, really do. And I have a bad feeling that we're going to continue to go in this direction. So if you take nothing else away from this podcast, I will say definitely, and kind of, let's call it my hour-long therapy session of trying to reconnoiter myself to what exactly this movie was and what this movie means for the future of movies. It's that of everything that we've kind of been building towards since kind of the Marvel domination and takeover and the DC of it all, and all the different attempts at all the different crazy franchise experimentation that we've been going through, we've now settled in this point where we have the giant blockbusters, and those are only going to be in theaters. And we have kind of the more thought-driven, auteurist pieces that can occasionally get these big movie stars. And those are either going to be in TV film, limited series, or, shortened TV form, and those are going to be on streaming, right? And the problem is that we're slowly losing the ability to go to a theater and enjoy a movie for anything other than the spectacle of it all. And the reason why that concerns someone like me so much is I love movies, but I also love kind of the discussion around movies, right? The thing that, and Khris can speak to this too, obviously, is that the enjoyment factor for movies, and specifically with the theater-going experience, comes from being able to hang out with your friends or that water cooler and have that awesome water cooler discussion. It's what made the early days of the internet so awesome, was because you could connect with these people all around the globe and have these awesome in-depth conversations about movies. But now, it's always dependent on what Hollywood will provide for us. And if that's the best that they're going to come up with is just this cheap artifice, where does the conversation go as far as that goes? Now, I'll admit, a big part of this does come from the fact that the internet has kind of, in a weird way, allowed for nitpicking to become way, way more mainstream. It's allowed for people to pick up on and point out on the most minute details that no one ever would have cared about at all from before. And it's kind of, in a way, led to kind of this whole secondary, film criticism movement of kind of, I'll call it troll criticism, which is where they're only pointing out these things just to point them out, as far as that goes. And it really adds nothing to this, to the discussion as far as that goes. It adds nothing to the discussion around and kind of the enjoyment factor of the movie. And Hollywood, in a weird way, has kind of been playing around with that and kind of been trying to, play into those sensibilities, where now it's almost like they're trying to troll the trolls as far as, okay, well, you pointed out this nitpick. Well, we're going to intentionally put all this shit in there just to fuck with people. We're going to have people are making fun of the Fast and Furious movies. Okay, well, we're going to lean into the stupidity as far as that goes, and it's all because of kind of this artifice. So the internet has definitely contributed to that as far as that goes. But far be it from me to give way more credit to this Space Jam movie than it deserves. But ultimately, I feel like that's what this movie represents, because where else is the conversation as far as that goes? I didn't want to fall into the trap of talking about the behind-the-scenes problem, because quite frankly, this wasn't one of those things where it was really that interesting. The most that I could talk about was the fact that this movie was in development hell for so long. But it's just a situation of where, like, okay, this movie, sure, it was compelling for all the wrong reasons. It was engaging for all the wrong reasons. It had poppy, flashy visuals, and it'll distract a 3-year-old, right? If you just want to plop a 3-year-old in front of a screen, in order for them to be distracted for 2 hours, sure, it accomplished that, but that's all it does, and that's all it is, and that's all it represents, And I can't even really go into the LeBron thing of it all, because I have a feeling that LeBron doesn't even really care. LeBron probably showed up, shot all of his stuff, and left. And he doesn't care about this, because he doesn't have to, because he's worth billions of dollars. He doesn't have to care about this movie. So, at the end of the day, kind of, if I can go into my final thoughts on this movie, it's weird, because, again, it's another one of those podcasts where I barely talked about the movie itself, but Space Jam 2, ultimately, it's the first movie that I would say, yeah, this is cynical, and yeah, this is just a hollow artifice, and yeah, this has nothing going for it as far as creative endeavors. I guess the reason why I'm never really as harsh on the Marvel movies as Khris is because at the end of the day, aside from all of the Marvelisms, Kevin Feige, it is just kind of, it's kind of just by happenstance that those movies ended up becoming as big and popular as they are. But Kevin Feige is trying to do something creatively minded. It's just everything else that goes into those movies that makes them as popular as they are, right? And the fact that they're probably not as compelling as they probably could be. And the fact that it does feel that it's one guy overseeing all of these different movies that makes it feel more like television. But at the end of the day, those movies do still have some sense of creative mind behind them, just not in the areas where it counts and where it's focused on. This movie, though, there's none of that. There's absolutely none of that. The only ounce and bit of joy that I can get from it is Don Cheadle. And even him at the end, it's like, okay, it's just another simple smash and grab villain, and he ultimately doesn't matter at the end, because this movie is nothing. This movie accounts for nothing. This movie applies for nothing other than go subscribe to HBO Max. That's literally what the takeaway from this movie is go subscribe to HBO Max. And if anything, if I hadn't already been a subscriber of HBO for years beforehand, because of HBO, before HBO Max came around, I would say I'm not going to get HBO Max at all. Because if it just means that we're going to be getting more movies like this, then that's not worth that $15 a month or however much they have it for as far as that goes. Now, obviously, I know that it's not going to be the last one to come out, but we obviously know the good thing is that the rest of the HBO Max slate for the rest of the year looks to be pretty promising between Suicide Squad, Reminiscence, Many Saints of Newark, Dune. It looks to be pretty promising as far as that goes. But for my money, as far as I'm concerned, this is the worst movie of the year for all the reasons that I listed above, because at the end of the day, it doesn't even work as a movie. Forget all of the other commercial elements. Forget all of the other kid elements. Forget the sports elements. Forget the Warner Brothers elements. This doesn't work as a movie. The plot is not compelling. The characters, what character even is there? Any sort of interesting idea that's brought up is not followed through. Basic fundamentals of storytelling, which I've talked about on this podcast before. That's what's missing here, And I know that a lot of people are going to be coming at it. It's like, and doing the whole usual turn your brain off. But guess what? I can't do that. I just can't. I can't do that at this point. That's not me. That's never been who I am. That's not what I get out of movies. And I understand that I'm in the minority as far as a majority of people don't go into movies looking for any of the stuff that I look for. And I get that. And I've made my peace with that. But overall, I can't get behind something that is ultimately this shallow and this cynical when it directly contradicts and goes against the idea of audiences and what they get and what they ultimately want from their movies. It's just I can't. It's just another excuse of studios treating us like simpletons. And I don't think that people like that as far as that goes. I mean, I don't know. For all intents and purposes, they might like that, But it's also just the fact that movies just don't have the place in the culture that they used to anymore. But that has nothing to do with movies in and of themselves. That just has to do with rapidly advancing technology as far as streaming goes. And streaming and the rapidly advancing technology and access to it ultimately making them more disposable by nature. But there's nothing really that we can do about that. If anything, that just puts more of a challenge to the artist as far as, okay, now we know our medium is becoming more disposable, so how can we make something that is still that people are going to want to watch? And a lot of people are going to want to watch this because of the commercial advertising and marketing that Warner Brothers does. And honestly, like so many of the other movies that they've done in the last couple of years, that's all that this has going for it. And for all of those reasons, I'm giving this movie, I couldn't even give this, like, I know Khris is usually a lot less harsh, but again, I spared Khris. As I said before, I'm like, I wanted to spare him and anyone else from having to watch this movie because I don't want anyone to watch this movie. If there's one thing that you can take away from this podcast, it's do not watch Space Jam: A New Legacy. Just go watch the first one. It's so much more entertaining. There's so much more to it. It's just so much more fun, right? Ultimately, that movie is just so much more fun, and this one isn't. So I'm giving this movie 1.5 stars for Don Cheadle's performance and for the sort of inkling of an idea of what they could have done with the Looney Tunes. But other than that, this movie has nothing going for it. This movie is nothing. Again, I don't qualify this as a movie. This is probably the worst movie that I've seen so far this year. It's just disappointing, ultimately. It really is, given that I'll say this again, I sound like a broken record, but I go into these movies, I want to like these movies. I want to enjoy them, Yeah, because I've seen something be a giant commercial for a product before and haven't worked and haven't been a really compelling movie. It was called The Lego Movie, But I don't know. I don't know what's happened to all of the creators. I don't know what's happened to their ability to actually create art, and I don't know. And those are questions that I won't be able to answer on this podcast, and I'm not gonna lie, I probably won't ever be able to answer. But I'll do my best to keep going forward. So that was it. That was my review for Space Jam: A New Legacy. Let me know what you guys thought of the solo podcast format. Let me know how I did. What's it called? Definitely, I feel like Khris and I will bring that up as a point of preference on our next week's podcast, which of course next week's another doubleheader, so something to look forward to as far as that goes. We'll be reviewing both the movie of the week, which is M. Night Shyamalan's new upcoming movie, Old. Cannot freaking wait for that because it's been too long since we've had a Shyamalan movie, and I after this piece of shit that I just watched, I need something that just knows that it's bad to just sit back and watch and enjoy. So that's coming. And we've also got the premiere of Ted Lasso Season 2 next week, which we will be covering actually on the podcast, not just on the variety show next week. We'll be covering that on the podcast. I'm very excited about that because hopefully it means that we'll be getting back to some quality content and then we'll be getting into August. Talkin' Thrones, of course, comes back. We are officially back this week. Last night, we obviously had the Season 2 premiere. Myself and Pat broke down the first episode of Season 2. Lots to talk about there. Definitely go check that out. I've got a couple more top 10 lists coming out on Wednesdays going forward to tide us through for the rest of the summer. It's still crazy to me that we're already halfway through July. Summer is already almost over. It's kind of insane. as far as that goes, just, getting my brain used to that. As far as that goes, just time only gets faster as you get older, people. Just keep that in mind. And as always, you guys know what to do. Follow us on our Facebook and Instagram at Talkin TV Podcast on both in order to keep up with everything that we've got going on. Be sure to click the subscribe button, click the like button, leave a comment section, leave a comment down below. Please comment away. That if I can make this video the most commented on video of our entire YouTube thing so far, I would, because I really want to know people's thoughts, and I really got to hear from them, because again, a lot of people have talked to me that said that they loved this movie, and I have to know what it is that they got out of it. So that's it. Leave them in the comment section below. Let me know what you thought about Space Jam: A New Legacy. Let me know what you thought of the solo podcast format. Be sure to follow Khris and everything that he's doing with his social media profiles, Facebook and Instagram, at Christian Ivanko, Evanko. That's how you follow that. He's got an album that he's going to be dropping at some point this year, so definitely be sure to go and check that out. Follow myself if you want at Movie Nerd Reviews on Facebook and Instagram. I'm not as big on presence, let's say, on my social media profiles as I probably should. And as always, people, you know the sign-off. I've done it so many times now. Will I change it at some point? I don't know. Probably not. 12 seasons in a short film. Watch more fucking movies. I'll see you guys.